Hi, let's continue with the for loops. I think for loop is the most beautiful and sometimes most useful looping structure. Especially when you learn collections, you will see the difference. Okay, for loops seems the other loops. The difference is you don't declare any counter for loops, or you don't need to use exit keyword. You select the start and the end points, and then your query iterates the numbers between the lower bound and the upper bounds. Now let's see our diagram and explain on that. First, we write our for keyword, then the counter. The counter is just a name. It's a name declared as an integer. For example, I or v counter or etc. We don't write any data type for it. It's an integer by default. We cannot reach the counter outside of the loop. We cannot assign any value to the counter. Now, then we write our in keyword. In keyword specifies that I will write a collection or a list of something. The count of this list specifies how many times we will iterate. Then we may write reverse keyword. This is optional. This keyword reverses the v counter. That means it will iterate from the last to the first. I will show that. Then we write our lower bound, which means from which number to start. Our counter's first value. Our counter starts iterating from this number. This must be a number. Then we write two dots between lower bound and the maximum limit upper bound. Upper bound is the maximum value of the counter. Our iteration finishes when the counter reaches to the upper bound. Then our loop keyword. Then our statements. Unlike the other loops, there is no counter in here or no exit in here. We specified our counter and where to finish in the beginning. We have only our business in here. Then the end loop keyword. This keyword finishes our loop logic. And our bounds cannot be null. Lower bound and upper bound does not need to be integers. They can be expressions or variables, etc. But the results must be integers at the end. If these expressions does not return integers, they are rounded to integer values. If lower bounds and upper bounds are the same, it will iterate just one time. If lower bound is greater than the upper bound, it will not iterate. When we continue with our lessons like composite data types, we will learn some other usages of for in loops. But for now, we will learn the basic usage of for loops now. Now let's make some examples for the for in loops. Let's open up our SQL Developer. Okay, let's write our code now. Begin and for I in 1.3 and loop keyword. What we did in here is we declared an integer counter variable I without a data type. It's implicitly declared as integer. Then we say that my integer I will start from 1 and continue looping until it reaches to 3. It will iterate by 1 in each iteration by default. Then our loop keyword. Now we can print I to see if it increases. dbms output.putLine. Let's say my counter is and concatenate with I variable. Then end loop and our end. Now let's write set server output again and execute that first, and let's run our code. Okay, great. For loop is pretty good. You cannot stuck into an infinite loop with for loops. Now, let's update our number 1 to 3 to 3 to 3 now. Let's clear our script and change this with 3 and execute our code. As we can see, it iterated for 1 time, and since the first value of I is 3, it printed I as 3. Then stopped the iteration. Now, let's update our lower bound to a greater value than the upper bound. For example, 5 to 3. When we run that, it did not loop as it is expected. Because when upper bound is greater than lower bound, it does not iterate. We said that we have another keyword named reverse to reverse our iteration. Let's change our bounds to 1 to 3 again. And then write a reverse before the lower bound. Let's run that. Perfect. This time our counter I started from the upper bound and looped decreasing towards the lower bound. Be careful, we did not change the place of lower bound and upper bound. What I mean is, if we write reverse 3.1, there won't be any iteration. Let's check it. As we can see, it did not loop. So left side must be smaller than the right side anyway. If you want to loop back, you just use reverse keyword. Now, that's enough for the for loops. Let's turn back to our slide now. Alright, we have seen 3 types of loops up to now. So which one should we use? Of course, we can use any of them. We can do our business with any in any way. No problem. But which of these will be better and when? Now, if you use basic loops, it will iterate at least 1 time, and the statements before the exit statement will be executed. I recommend you to use basic loops that must iterate at least 1 time. In some other languages, we know this as do-while loops. Maybe some of you know that. But be careful not to stuck into an infinite loop. This loop is good, but a bit dangerous. You have to handle finish conditions well. So when to use while loops then? While loops iterates until the condition returns false. That means you may not know when it will finish iterating. I mean, after how many iterations? Actually, basic loops and while loops resemble to each other. So what is the difference? The difference is basic loop iterates at least 1 time, but while loop may not. If the condition is false in the first check, it directly goes to the end of the loop and finishes it. Generally, we check the condition in exit when in basic loops, and this is done in the last most of the times. But while loops does that in the beginning of the statement. So I recommend you to use while loops if you use a condition that returns true or false. You know where to use for loops more clearly. If you exactly know where to start or where to finish, you use for loops. Unlike the other loops, for loops does not have the risk of infinite loops, so it's safer. Besides, you can use collections with for loops. I will show later, but with for loops, you can loop through an array without knowing the size of it. You will see that in collections lesson. I recommend you to use for loops when you exactly know where to start and where to end. Most of the times you can use any of the loops to do your job, but I tried to explain which to select in different cases. Just be careful about the infinite loops in basic and while loops. So this is the end of for loops lesson. See you in the next lessons.